This unit, or this lesson, was part of a unit on mystery genre where the anchor text is The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. So prior to today, the students read The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, and we worked through a very complicated text and sort of the language and the lingo that comes with the original text that's difficult for students. And then they actually worked through a lot of text-dependent questions with evidence-based answers. And then even in that story, we watched the audio, we listened to the audio in certain sections, did some close reading and analysis of other sections, and then watched the entire television version of the entire story. And from there did some analysis as well. So this is the second story out of a series of 3 that we're going to read from the original text. So prior to today's lesson, they actually have read the first 8 pages of this story. There's about 17 pages total in the entire story. So we've read about half of the story over the last 2 days in the classroom, where they had a chance to ask questions, talk with their partners about what's going on in the story, but they've been doing all of the reading in class. And then yesterday worked on the text-dependent questions in the classroom so that they could work with partners and sort of tag team on the evidence and looking for information. So that's what's happened prior to today. So today's lesson was sort of the culminating part of the first half of the story. Then tomorrow we'll pick up where they have not read yet, and they'll work on the reading in class tomorrow, and then work on the text-dependent questions after we have a whole class discussion. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes is many, many, many stories put into one book. So we've selected 3 different stories. So the first one that we read was not as complicated as this one is. That one was a little bit easier to understand. The plot, the crime was easier. And we've been working on the elements of mystery and trying to pick out clues and look at the structure of mystery. We've read some short mysteries, 5-minute mysteries or You Be the Judge sort of stories to sort of build their skills. And now we're working through the complex text of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, which can be difficult for a lot of students. So this is the second of 3 stories that we'll read from the book.
Talk about the standards targeted in this lesson. What did you do to make the lesson reflect the full intent of that standard?
There are a lot of standards that I used. Probably the most important one was RL 7.1, which was citing several pieces of textual evidence to support analysis of what the text says. So I think you saw that when they were doing the numbered heads together and had to come back into the text to support all of their answers. We've spent a lot of time working on RL 7.4, which is looking at words and phrases. The vocabulary is very difficult. So one of the activities they've had to do is I've targeted key vocabulary words, and they've had to look at it in context and then make an inference on its meaning. You saw a little bit of that today as well. We're working harder on RL 7.7, where they're comparing the written text to other forms of media. So you saw the audio version of the text with the film version and heard them making some of their comparisons. And then we're also working on SL 7.1, especially collaborating with peers, working with partners, working in small groups about the text and discussing the text and getting their information from each other. I really wanted to work on Correction 1, which is complex and high quality text. In the past, the students have read some of the adapted versions of the story, so I really wanted them to use the original version because the vocabulary, the sentence structure, it's just so much deeper and richer for them. And then I really wanted to work through Correction 2 so that all of their activities were text specific. So their conversations were text specific, their answers were text specific. I wanted them to work with portions of the text that were very challenging or hard to understand. So I've been working hard on those to help them a little bit. And then Correction 3 on the student engagement, that's probably the one thing that I work on the most with them, is to work with other people, communicate with other students, be engaged with the text and with the people sitting at their tables and in their group and having conversation about the text. I definitely think shifts 2 and 3 were probably at the center of the lesson. The text is very complex. It's probably the hardest text that my students have seen this year so far. A lot of my students in that classroom are ESL students and bilingual students, and the vocabulary is very difficult for them, along with some of my special needs students in there as well. So the text was very, very complex for them, but I also think they did really well using the evidence to support their ideas, both written and verbally. They have written answers that they'll be turning in to me tomorrow with their evidence. And I think the questions that I was asking them required them to go back into the text and really use the text to help them, answer the questions that they needed to do and complete the activities. Prior to Common Core, I always taught the adapted versions of the stories, so they were much shorter. The language was simplified greatly, mostly because I didn't think they could understand the complex text, and I was actually fearful that they wouldn't be able to understand it on their own. But I think they've proved me wrong many, many times, and I would have my teaching assistants or my support teacher read out loud to certain students, and they were never really reading the text. They were sort of just engaged in my conversation with the text, or I would read out loud to them and then we would just discuss as a whole class, and I never was asking them to really go back into the text to prove anything. And there wasn't any vocabulary that they struggled with, or the sentences were very simple. So my instruction prior to that was much simpler and maybe just easier for me than this text. I think one of the greatest things that I've had this year is to be able to have other teachers in the classroom. So the ESL teachers able to push in a couple of days a week, the support teachers in the classroom, and they're there to really support the kids in understanding vocabulary. I actually have used a program for some of the students where the vocabulary next to the original word, that word is explained to them in the text, so they have a little bit easier understanding it, a little bit of an easier time. I think also working with other partners and in their groups, they hear what other students are saying, and they all have to look for that evidence. They have to know that answer because they know someone's gonna have to share it, and I call on everybody. So that has helped a lot. I've always asked the students to read the text first, and then sometimes I will pull small groups and we'll just discuss in a smaller group some of the things that they don't understand. And I've chunked that text for them greatly, especially in that class where 50% of the students have some sort of need or disability. But they usually rise to the occasion with support and with someone just sort of encouraging them along the way. But sometimes I will change the questions a little bit for them, so it's not as complex of a question, but they're still pulling the same evidence that all of the other students will be pulling from the same text and reading the same words. I think this story, because it's complex and it's more in the 9th grade band, the students in my classroom who are a little bit more advanced, it's an opportunity for them to delve a little bit deeper into more complex text. I expect a little bit more precision from them in their answers on paper and verbally. I'll ask them to interpret the evidence a little bit more. I expect just more detailed answers from them, especially because the text is challenging them a little bit too, and they haven't really been used to that. So I've really been trying to work hard and make them more leaders in their groups to bring others along with them and asking them to actually work with other students that are of a different ability than they are.
Great.
I think you could clearly see that there was productive engagement in the lesson. All students had to write answers, all students had to share answers verbally, and then all students had to know the evidence that supports the group answer. So they all had to be engaged. They all knew that I would call on them. We do numbered heads together frequently, so they know that there's always going to be 4 questions. Everyone's going to have to share an answer, but I think they have more confidence because it's the group's answer. It's not just their answer, and they all have the evidence in front of them, so they can support what they're saying and build their ideas off of others. Well, the questions that they had to work on yesterday on their handout were the questions that I posed in the numbered heads together. So I knew that they knew something. They might not have been exactly correct, but I think making them go into the text, pull the evidence, share the evidence, and know it shows me that they can do that. When I look at their papers tomorrow, I'll know how they interpreted their evidence, because they have to not only just give me the evidence, but they have to interpret how that evidence supports the answer and supports the question that they're answering. So I'll know once I look at their sheets if they have done that second step, not just pulling the evidence, but how does that evidence support what they're actually saying. Once I look at their papers, I'll know pretty clearly. They have gotten so much better over the last few weeks as we've worked a little bit harder, and they know the expectations. They know that they're not off the hook. So if for example, they might have evidence, but they might not have interpreted it. So those are students that I'll pull aside during our work time and work with individually and expect a revision from, so that they can modify their answers and make them a little bit more precise and interpret the way that I've taught them to interpret evidence with text. So I don't let them off the hook, and I will work with them in a smaller setting, or sometimes as a whole class. If I notice there's a particular question that nobody seemed to really get with precision in their answer, then we'll do it together and we'll walk through it together, and they'll work, and everyone will write the same answer in the same sample so they have something to look off of. But we've done this many times already this year with multiple stories, so they do know my expectations and they know they're not off the hook if it's not what I need it to be. So I was really proud of the kids. The questions that they ask, the things they want to know, tells me they're really interested in the text, and I think that's always exciting for a teacher when they want to keep going and they don't want the story to end. They want to know the next part. And I know some students, it's hard for them not to move on in the text. They do a pretty good job of not doing that, because I don't want them to read the whole text at once, because there's lots of things along the way that we have to discuss. So I was really excited to see them excited and want to know more. I was really surprised at what they picked up on the differences between the filmed version of the story and what the text is actually, the written text was actually saying. I was really surprised at how quickly they picked up on those differences, which tells me they really knew the text and they could really compare it to the film version of the text. So I was really surprised at that, and I was proud of their involvement in the lesson, how they all interact with each other and help each other out and have conversations that are encouraging. I'm not sure yet what I would have changed. I think I would have maybe done a little bit more analysis with that passage in particular. Probably tomorrow we'll go back and we'll look at the structure of the sentences. We'll look at some of the language and the vocabulary.